Alrighty, this is the second part to the presentation on reviewing the literature. So if you haven't watched the first part, go back and do that now. The first part, of course, deals with searching for articles and doing an analysis of the articles. Now, once you have completed that part, so the analysis involves finding relevant articles, at least 10 at this point. So you had 5 for the first assignment and then 5 for the second. And then with the second assignment, you construct a table in which you summarize the results of your analysis. So you're essentially taking information from the article analysis form and putting it into a table so that you can visualize patterns across studies. And that's what we're going to focus on with this section. We're looking at a synthesis. So up until now, you've taken pieces, you've looked at individual bits of information from studies, like the participant, the research question, the dependent variables, independent variables, summaries of the results. That's an analysis. A synthesis involves looking across studies. So I always start with my table and I look across studies, and by now, after reading these articles, you've also hopefully been taking some notes and you've recognized possibly some patterns. But at this point, look across all those studies, look at your table, look at your notes. Do you see any major trends or patterns across studies? So, for example, do you see that most, for example, just to pick a topic, I'm going to share an outline later in this presentation. A colleague of mine, Ed Cancio, we were looking at level systems. Ed was a EBD teacher, and he used class-wide level systems in his classroom, and it was something he was really interested in. And we noticed that there was some early research, and they were used a lot in back, even starting the 70s and 80s and early 90s. But then there was a period of very little research. Uh, and this was due to several things. Part of it was due to, we believed, were some misconceptions that people had about level systems. They had, over time, had sometimes were used punitively, and that wasn't their original purpose. So we wrote a paper. We actually wrote a couple of articles about this, and we looked at research. And one of the patterns we saw is that the research was conducted in the 70s and 80s primarily, and then there was not much research. So that was one major pattern that we saw. Um, the studies that we did see that were published later tended to have a negative view of level systems, and they focused on the way they were being misused. So that was another pattern. So the studies that the major trend would be not much research in the last 15 to 20 years. And then the second, how did the studies relate? Well, early studies were very positive and they focused on using level systems they were real common in programs for students with emotional and behavioral disorders. If you're not familiar with level systems, you start out with really frequent reinforcers that are easy to obtain, and then as students progress through different levels, they have access to bigger reinforcers, but those reinforcers are more delayed and they're harder to get. And there's also a change in expectations as you go from one level to another. So in the early research, this was a way of systematizing a shaping process, and that's really what led to its initial development. It's how can you take the process of shaping, going from really immediate reinforcement to more delayed reinforcement, expecting, shaping behavior so that you're transferring more and more responsibility onto the student. That was a logic behind the initial studies. Later on, that shifted and they became more punitive, and their focus was on moving students down levels when they didn't do well, and as a consequence you get busted back to level one, and that was the tone of the studies in the 80s, and then that led to sort of this negative perception of these systems that we saw around 2000, the year 2000, and so they were really viewed very negatively. But what we saw in reading those articles with those folks only were focusing on those later studies in which they were essentially misused. So we identified that as a gap in the research, that there's no recent research about effective use of level systems. There were misperceptions, and people sort of lost sight of their original purpose and were using them in ways that weren't intended. And then there was some research more recently that was related to PBIS literature and how level systems could be used as part of a secondary level or tier two kind of intervention. So that was a little research there. So that was essentially what we got from looking across studies. So when you look at your study, questions to ask: do you see any major patterns? What is the relationship among the different studies that you read, or do you see any relationship? There's some relationship there. How do the studies relate to one another? And then, are there any gaps in the research? For instance, a gap may be that we see the intervention implemented in clinical settings but not in school settings, or most of the research is with young children. There's little research with older students or adolescents, that sort of thing. And then, what are the directions for future research? Now, one of your sources here is, if you've, at the end of any well-written article, the author should talk about further research. And if you've been paying attention to the articles as you've read them, you probably have gotten some ideas about the next step. And of course, this is what builds up to your actual proposed research study. When you write a review of the literature, you're essentially setting the occasion or setting the stage for, okay, this is the research, this is what we know about this particular subject, this is what the research says. However, there's a need for more information about, and then you talk about it, and then you said, therefore, the purpose of my study is, and you give the rationale for your study. So the process of building up to that is what we're discussing in this presentation. Once you answer those questions, start sketching out an outline. So most people, when they start to write something like a lit review, they just start trying to write it cold, and they get really frustrated. I did that myself when I was a student. I would spend hours writing 2 or 3 pages and then tear it up and start over and start over. Do yourself a big favor. Start out with an outline. It will save you an incredible amount of time and frustration. So start out with big topics. So even if you have an outline that starts out with 4 major areas that are related to those questions on the previous page, that's a good start. Then you start slowly fleshing in information. So start with big ideas and then build each one of those sections. This is a rough outline of that topic I was just talking about with level systems. So we started out, we had some research about the origins of level systems way back in the 60s and into the 80s. And then we talked about what were the original goals, like developing skills, fading schedules of reinforcement, generalization and maintenance, and reintegration. So that was the purpose of these systems to begin with. And then we focused on, well, there's not much in the last 10 or 15 years. This was back a while ago when we wrote this. And the research that was there was looking at whole packages. Like there wasn't much in the way of component analysis or what aspects of these systems actually were causing them to be effective. And then there was some recent research with using school-wide positive behavior interventions, school-wide positive behavior support. And then we talked about areas for needed research and then current trends and practices. So that built up to where we took off with our paper. So in this example, we had 3 major areas, the A, B, and C. And then once we had established that, we went in and started filling in information. Now, what will happen, at the very least, each of these will be a section of your lit review. In this case, it was 3 sections. And then each of those enumerated items is a short paragraph. For example, there was a short paragraph about the engineered classroom by Hewart and how that worked, and then another short paragraph about the achievement place model. 4 short paragraphs in the next section and 6 short paragraphs in the following one. As you make your outline, pull together your notes. So hopefully as you were reading those many articles and jotting down some notes, um, pull those together, organize them. It's sometimes helpful to put them on index cards, your notes. I typically don't do that, but I'll use smaller sheets of paper, and I try to keep notes so that I've got one section of notes on a small sheet. So you can actually do this electronically as well, but can you organize your information? And at this point, it's fine to work in bullet points, but organize it according to your outline. Group things together that go together. Um, Within the topic of your research, look for similarities and differences among studies. So this is where the table is really helpful. As you look at the table you created, what similarities do you see? And then what differences do you see? That can be an important statement when you synthesize the information across studies. Do you see any real clear gaps, or as you read the studies, did a number of the authors all point to some of the same gaps in the research or areas that needed to be further studied? It's always a good idea as you read a collection of articles. Most likely you picked out a few studies that resonated with you, that you thought were very closely related to what you wanted to do and that were more important. So a good plan is pick out 2 or 3 articles that you want to describe in more detail, and maybe even 2. Um, and that would be sort of, as you sum up, you go into more detail about those studies and what they included, and then what what's the next step in research. In other words, they're important studies because they're sort of setting the stage for the research that you were proposing. Um, then talk about the conclusions and implications of all the research. And then again, what are the suggested areas for research? And then how are you going to address an area of need with your study? In other words, how does your study build to the research that's already been done, and how will it extend that? How will this research add to the body of knowledge that we have? The textbook lists several different approaches to writing introductions or reviews of the literature. That's what the introduction is. Um, the simplest approach, there are a couple that I like, and this is one of them, just accumulating evidence approach. This is the simplest model, and I'm going to suggest that you follow this one unless you have a reason not to. The biggest reason not to would be if your research question involves a comparison question. There's another approach to summarizing research that fits with that type of research. If you have a demonstration type question, this approach works really well. So essentially it would start out with a general statement about the topic or the issue. For example, I've been doing some research with some of the BCBA students on anxiety with individuals with disabilities. So students with diagnosed anxiety disorders or students with on the autism spectrum. So if I was going to, well, we actually have written some papers. So the initial statement would be a topic about how prevalent anxiety is and how individuals with disabilities have a disproportionately, even though it's very common, it's even higher among individuals on the autism spectrum and certainly among students who have diagnosed anxiety disorders. And then we talk about how does anxiety affect people? Well, it interferes with their ability to function, with social relationships, with the ability to be successful in school and just general well-being. It can have long-lasting negative effects on people in all kinds of different ways. We talk about that. The next section is a series of reference statements about current knowledge. So these would be the synthesized statements. In other words, across studies, we know that a lot of the research on for addressing issues with anxiety involves approaches that are generally less effective for individuals on the autism spectrum. In other words, cognitive behavior therapy and interventions that involve a lot of verbal dialogue between a therapist and a participant or patient. And for individuals who have difficulty with verbal skills, though those can be very challenging. And if an individual can't self-report, it makes it very hard. So those would be the type of statements that we would go into. Then a statement about the gap in knowledge leading up to the rationale of the study. Well, the gap in knowledge is we have a number of interventions that are being used to address anxiety with individuals on the autism spectrum. But a lot of them are not research based, like weighted vest, sensory integration. It's just some of the different things we talked about in class. And of the interventions that do have a research basis, they're not as effective for individuals with more limited verbal skills. So that's a huge gap in the research knowledge. And then the purpose of statement would be the purpose of this study is to investigate the effectiveness and efficacy of a visually based app for calming strategy for individuals with autism. So that would be essentially how that lit review would shake out. So that's a good model. And I would add, if there's one or two studies that are closely related to your article, sort of at the end, maybe in section B, that will be where you would include a more detailed description about a couple of articles. This is the other one that I mentioned could be useful. So if you have a comparison type question, let's say that a couple of people have expressed interest in looking at the picture exchange communication system, and then another commonly used intervention is the core vocabulary approach that speech and language pathologists advocate. So suppose you wanted to do a study and you wanted to compare the effectiveness of PECS and core vocabulary on the development of communication skills with students with autism spectrum disorder. Well, first of all, you start out with a general statement about the topic. So that would be, individuals on the autism spectrum generally have limitations, and it's a defining feature is deficits in communication and social skills, and how that, sorry, my puppy's barking at somebody outside, how that will affect an individual, how important that is. Then you describe both the options. So you would have a description of core vocabulary and what it actually involves, a description of PECS and what that involves, and you would cite some research to support both of them. Then in the next section, you actually contrast the two alternatives. So here you get into more detail of what the research says about each one. So it would be good to have some studies that were written by strong advocates of each position. It's unfair at this point if I was, for instance, let's say that I favored PECS over core vocabulary and I only reported studies that were conducted by authors who were really demonstrating the effectiveness of PECS and didn't really like core vocabulary. That's not presenting these options in a fair manner. So I want to be sure that I get some references of articles that were written by individuals who are proponents of each view of core vocabulary and PECS, and I have a summary of the research for each one. Then I give my rationale of the current study. And of course my research question here is going to be a comparison kind of question, and hopefully I've designed it in such a way that it's going to give a fair assessment of the effectiveness of each of these interventions or approaches. This is a model Model 3 historical perspectives approach. This is more typical of someone who is going to be doing a review of the literature, which none of you are going to do. But it's a useful model. So you start out with a statement about the topic, as they all do, and then you describe the emergence of the literature. So in other words, where did it come from? So I guess there's an element of this in any lit review, but in this approach you're focusing more on the development of a body of knowledge across time. And then you would talk about the next steps and the rationale for your study. And usually in this case, it's you're reviewing literature, or you're looking at 10 years of research on functional communication training, or something of that nature. So that's probably not an approach that any of you are going to use, but it's a very useful one to use later on when you do things like a lit review. And this is a discrepant knowledge approach. This is the kind of review that you would write if you were going to approach a topic that you believe is not supported by the literature, but yet it's something that needs to be researched. For example, I would have to say, if I were going to do a paper on sensory integration therapy, this is the way I would write the lit review. I would start out by the topic of sensory integration therapy is used extensively across the country for children with disabilities, and I would describe the body. There's not much research to support because there's much research supporting it, and as a matter of fact, there's a growing body of research that suggests that it's not effective. So I would have some studies written by proponents of sensory integration therapy, and then I would report data from or studies that have compared sensory integration to behaviorally or functionally based approaches. And then I would build my rationale for my study, how it's going to add to that body of research. So for example, if I was going to do a study on weighted vests, that's another area that is something that's used incredibly, but used very widely, but there's essentially no research showing that it's supported. So um, some of you may choose this approach if you have an area that you want to study that is you believe is not supported by research, and you want to design a study basically to test it out. This would be the kind of approach you would use. So as you can probably tell, there's a lot of similarity between these two, and you don't have to settle in. You could write a very good review of the literature using elements of several of these. I'm going to suggest you make it easy on yourself. Use either the first one or the second one as your model, unless there's some reason. And you can certainly, in doing that, pull elements out of any of these models. Uh, it's not one or the other, but I think this is a good starting point. The key to this is start writing. It's a lot easier to edit something once it's written than just to write to begin with. So I know when I was early in my career, when I would try to write, I would get obsessed over the wording of a sentence, and I would write and rewrite one sentence over and over again. And an hour later, I'm 3 or 4 lines further along, and you get really frustrated doing that. Be concerned initially with just getting information down, then go back and fix it later. Be sure you do go back and edit it later. Don't be so eager just to get it turned in that you're submitting something that is not well written. But in the beginning, get a good outline created. I can't stress enough how much easier that makes the process, working from a good detailed outline versus trying to just write something from scratch. So determine which of these models fits your study, and I'm suggesting either the first or second model unless you've got a reason to pull elements from some of those other models. Start out with an outline with big ideas and then begin to flesh it in with information. This process takes time. You can't do this at the last minute. So give yourself time to work on this. Start it early and well before this is due. And then start writing your first draft. By reading all the articles, you should be pretty familiar with APA style now and different levels of headings. I'm going to suggest maybe stick with 3 levels. There is such a thing as a fourth and fifth level in APA, but stick with a 3 levels to organize your paper. It makes it a lot more complicated when you use those higher levels. Um, so you start with your outline, begin to put it in paragraph form. A good way to do that is the outline essentially determines the APA levels that you're working with. Um, Start out with a description of your topic, then integrate your notes. Again, get your information down, get a draft, and then if you should have connected with a peer at this point, someone with whom you're going to share information back and forth. Once you get a working draft, swap drafts with one another. Read each other's draft and give the person feedback of what does and doesn't make sense. Again, and once you look at something for a while, it's hard sometimes to tell if it actually makes any sense. You sort of, your brain fills in information that might not be there, or you assume that someone has a background knowledge that he or she may not have because you've read a bunch of articles at this point. So it's important to give it to someone else, because what does this look like from the perspective of someone that hasn't read those 10 articles that you have at this point? So get your draft down, um, refine it, and when you submit your introduction, I expect it to probably be a third or fourth draft. So again, let me stress, this isn't something you can do. You can't do this if this assignment is due on a Wednesday and it's Tuesday and you're starting to write it. You're in a lot of trouble already. You need time to put this together, and you need time to think it through. Um, as with the other assignments, please don't send me drafts before it's graded and ask me to look at it and give you feedback. I can't do that because I can't do that for everybody. However, as with everything else, I can answer questions. So ask me any question you want to ask about your review, about your introduction section as you write it. And it's fine if you want to attach it and send it along so I can refer to it, but um, just ask questions and I can answer your questions. Fair enough? So happy writing, and good luck with diving into your introduction section.